The year is 1887. The place, Dust Creek. It wasn't a town so much as a scar on the face of the earth, a place where the sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer and the wind never ceased its mournful song. The dust, a fine red powder, was a constant plague. It coated every surface, gritted between the teeth, and settled deep in the lungs, a permanent reminder that life here was a slow, grinding erosion of the soul. The buildings, made of sun-bleached, splintering wood, leaned against one another for support, their false fronts peeling like sunburnt skin. Hope was a currency scarcer than water, and survival was a bitter sacrament taken each dawn. This was a land that broke things, wagon wheels, horses' legs, and men's spirits. It was no place for a dreamer. Clara May Thompson, at 19 years of age, was a dreamer. She was a flower pressed between the pages of a Bible, delicate and preserved, yet utterly ignorant of the world beyond the book's covers. Her life had been circumscribed by two unyielding forces, the Word of God and the will of her mother, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson was a widow, a woman whose grief had calcified into a rigid, unbending piety. She saw sin in laughter, vanity in a new ribbon, and the devil's handiwork in any thought that strayed from Scripture and duty. Clara was raised in this sterile environment, her spirit carefully pruned and shaped to be obedient, quiet, and pure. She learned to cook, to sew, to pray, and to lower her eyes in the presence of men. She dreamed, as girls do, but her dreams were chaste and vague. A cottage with whitewashed walls, a gentle husband whose hand she might hold in church, children with clean faces and reverent hearts. They were dreams spun from psalms and proverbs, not from the raw, chaotic stuff of life. Her father's death had shattered that fragile world. He had been a kind, if ineffectual, man, and with his passing came the revelation of his failures. Debts, long hidden, emerged like vultures to pick at the carcass of their modest life. The small house, the few acres of land, the respectability they had so carefully maintained. It was all forfeit. Suddenly, the Thompson women were destitute, their good name a tarnished coin. In Mrs. Thompson's unforgiving worldview, there was only one path to salvation, one way to preserve the family's honor from the stain of poverty and shame. That path was marriage. Clara, their only asset of value, was to be the sacrifice. The chosen husband was a man named Eli Kane. He was not a man of the town. He existed on its periphery, a solitary figure who lived in a run-down shack on a patch of useless, rocky land miles from anyone. He was a cowboy, but not the kind from dime novels. He owned no vast herds, commanded no loyal men. His wealth consisted of a handful of scrawny, half-wild horses and the clothes on his back. In Dust Creek, a man was measured by his land and his coin, and by that measure, Eli was less than nothing. He was quiet to the point of being invisible, his words as sparse as rain in a drought. When he did come to town for supplies, he moved like a shadow, his eyes downcast, his presence barely registering in the boisterous life of the saloon or the general store. The townsfolk regarded him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They called him the Silent Man, the ghost of the canyon. They saw a poor, ambitionless drifter, a man who would live and die without leaving a mark on the world. This was the man her mother had chosen. This was the man who would save their honor. The arrangement was made with the grim finality of a death sentence. Mrs. Thompson spoke of it as God's will, a trial to test their faith. Clara, numb with shock and despair, did not protest. To defy her mother was to defy God, a sin she had been taught to fear more than death itself. And so, she found herself standing in the small, stuffy church, a place that had once been her sanctuary, but now felt like a cage. The wedding was a hurried, pathetic affair. There were no flowers, no joyous music, only the drone of the preacher's voice and the shuffling feet of the few reluctant witnesses her mother had managed to assemble. They were not there to celebrate, but to observe, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and detached pity. Clara wore a simple, homespun dress. Not white, but a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to reflect the emptiness in her soul. It was her best dress, mended and clean, but it felt like a burial shroud. She stood beside Eli at the altar, acutely aware of his presence. He was taller than she had realized, lean and wiry, with hands that were calloused and scarred from hard labor. He smelled of horse, leather, and the dry earth itself. He never once looked at her. His gaze was fixed on the far wall, his face a mask of stoic indifference. When the preacher prompted him for his vows, his voice was a low, rough murmur, the words lost in the suffocating silence of the room. When it was her turn, Clara's voice was a whisper, a thread of sound so faint it barely stirred the air. "I do." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. The ring he placed on her finger was a simple, unadorned band of iron, cold and heavy, a manacle binding her to this stranger, to this desolate future. There was no reception, no well wishes. The moment the ceremony ended, the small crowd dispersed, eager to return to their own lives, leaving the newlyweds standing awkwardly in the merciless afternoon sun. A rough-hewn wagon, hitched to two of Eli's sad-looking horses, waited for them. It was to be their wedding carriage. Without a word, Eli took her small bundle of belongings and tossed it into the back before helping her onto the hard wooden seat. The gesture was functional, impersonal. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horses into a slow, plodding walk. The journey to his home was made in a silence that was heavier than any stone. The wagon wheels groaned in protest, kicking up clouds of the ever-present red dust. Clara sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the bleak horizon. She did not look at the man beside her, but she felt him. She felt the quiet strength in the way he held the reins, the complete stillness of his body. He was a mountain of silence, impassive and unreadable. Her mind, however, was a maelstrom of terror. All her life, she had been shielded from the coarser realities of the world. Her mother had spoken of the marital bed in hushed, fearful tones, alluding to a wife's duty and a husband's rights. It was a sacred, yet terrible, obligation, a cross a woman must bear for the sake of God and family. In Clara's terrified imagination, the night to come loomed as a monstrous violation, an act of brutal intimacy that she was powerless to refuse. She would be his property, her body an instrument for his pleasure, her innocence a thing to be broken and discarded. She looked at Eli's rough hands, his weathered face, and a wave of revulsion and fear washed over her. She saw not a husband, but a captor. This journey was not to a new home, but to her own personal Golgotha, the place where her girlhood would be crucified. The landscape grew more desolate with every turn of the wheels. They left the last vestiges of the town behind, entering a wilderness of rock, scrub brush, and skeletal trees. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. But the beauty of the sunset was lost on Clara. It felt like a portent, the sky bleeding for her, finally, as twilight deepened into dusk. Eli pulled the wagon to a halt. "We're here," his voice, the first words he had spoken to her directly since the ceremony, startled her. She looked and her heart sank. Home was a one-room shack, little more than a pile of weathered planks and mud chinking, huddled against a low, rocky bluff as if seeking shelter from the wind. A crude corral, holding a few more thin horses, stood nearby. The place radiated a profound and unshakable loneliness. It was the physical embodiment of all her despair. Eli jumped down and, again, came to her side of the wagon. He reached up to help her down, his hands briefly circling her waist. It was the first time he had truly touched her. His hands were firm, his grip surprisingly gentle, but Clara flinched as if she had been burned. She saw his jaw tighten for a fraction of a second, a flicker of some unreadable emotion in his eyes, before his face became a mask once more. He released her immediately and turned away. tending to the horses. Clara stood frozen, her small bag clutched in her hand, and watched him. He moved with an economy of motion, unhitching the horses, leading them to a trough, his actions methodical and practiced. He seemed completely oblivious to her presence, a man alone with his chores. The silence stretched, broken only by the nicker of the horses and the ever-present sigh of the wind. Finally, he finished his work and gestured toward the shack. "Go on inside. I'll start a fire." Her legs felt like lead as she walked to the door. It creaked open on leather hinges, revealing an interior that was as sparse as the land outside. The room was small, dominated by a rough stone fireplace on one wall and a single, narrow bed frame on the other. A crude table and 2 stools stood in the center. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. It was a place of stark, masculine simplicity, devoid of any comfort or softness. And the bed drew her eye like a magnet. It was neatly made, with a thin mattress and a couple of threadbare wool blankets. It was the altar upon which her sacrifice was to be made. She stood in the middle of the room, trembling, waiting for the inevitable. She heard Eli outside, the sound of an axe splitting wood. Then he entered, his arms laden with firewood. He moved to the fireplace, his back to her, and began to arrange the logs with quiet competence. He struck a match, and the kindling caught, casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn walls, making the small room seem even more claustrophobic. He straightened up, and finally, for the first time that day, he looked directly at her. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and in their depths, she saw not lust or cruelty, but a weariness so profound it seemed to sink into his very bones. The firelight carved lines of hardship into his face, making him look older than his years. He looked at her, then at the bed, and a long, heavy silence filled the space between them. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. The moment had come. She braced herself, her mind going blank with terror. Eli took a step, not toward her, but toward the bed. He picked up one of the 2 blankets, a thick, gray wool thing, and walked back to where she stood. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he gently, almost reverently, draped it around her shoulders. She was so stunned by the simple, paternal gesture that she could not move. Then he spoke, his voice low and even, devoid of any emotion she could name. "You take the bed." He turned and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the latch, his back still to her. "You sleep. I'll be outside." And with that, he opened the door, stepped out into the cold, dark night, and closed it softly behind him. Clara stood in the center of the room, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, staring at the closed door. The scent of him, leather and wood smoke, clung to the wool. The silence he left behind was of a different quality now. It was not menacing. It was empty. She listened, half expecting him to return, but the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the lonely howl of a distant coyote. Slowly, as if in a trance, she walked to the bed and sat down. She had been prepared for brutality, for a painful submission to a man's carnal needs. She had rehearsed prayers of endurance in her head, begged God for the strength to bear her cross. She had been ready for anything but this complete and utter nothing. He had not touched her. He had not demanded his rights. He had given her his bed, his blanket, his fire, and then he had left her entirely alone. He had treated her not as a wife, not as property, but as a guest, or perhaps as something even more fragile, something to be protected from himself. Clara lay down on the thin mattress, still fully dressed, the heavy wool blanket pulled up to her chin. The fire cast a warm, golden glow on the ceiling. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, her husband was sleeping on the cold ground. She felt a bewildering storm of emotions. Relief, so profound it was dizzying, washed over her. but tangled with it was a strange and unsettling confusion. He had rejected her. In a way, he had looked upon his bride and walked away. The townspeople called him useless, a man of no account. Her mother had sold her to him to settle a debt. And on their wedding night, this poor, silent, useless man had shown her a quiet, inexplicable decency that no one, least of all Clara herself, could ever have predicted. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the wilderness and the steady crackle of the fire, her mind racing. She had been married off, still innocent, to a poor cowboy, and what he had done on their wedding night was the most stunning thing of all. He had done nothing, and in that nothing, in that gentle, bewildering neglect, a story had begun. She just didn't know what kind of story it was yet. The days that followed settled into a routine of suffocating silence. Clara would wake at dawn on the narrow bed, the shack already empty. Through the single grimy window, she would see Eli, a lone figure moving with tireless purpose against the vast, empty canvas of the prairie. He was always working, mending fences, tending to his horses, reinforcing the corral. He moved with a rhythm that seemed as old and steady as the rising of the sun, a man who had made peace with endless, solitary labor. He never spoke to her unless absolutely necessary, and then only in clipped, functional phrases. "The well is there. Wood is stacked behind the house. Don't let the fire die." They were instructions, not conversation. He ate the food she prepared without comment, whether it was a decently cooked stew or a pathetically burned loaf of johnny cake. He would take his plate, sit on the stoop outside, and eat alone, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. After he finished, he would wash his own plate and utensils in the bucket outside before returning to his work, leaving Clara in a solitude that felt louder and more oppressive than any argument. This new life was a litany of hardships she had never imagined. Her hands, once soft and accustomed only to needlework, were now perpetually blistered and raw from hauling heavy buckets of water from the deep. Stubborn well. The wood-burning stove was a temperamental beast of iron and smoke. It either refused to light or blazed so hot it turned her meager attempts at baking into charcoal. She learned the ache of a back bent over a washboard, scrubbing the grime and sweat from Eli's coarse work clothes. She learned the smell of horse and hay and the sting of lye soap. Every muscle in her body cried out in protest, and every evening she would collapse onto her bed, a vessel of pure exhaustion, only to rise at dawn and begin the torment anew. In this crucible of toil and silence, Clara's feelings for Eli twisted into a complicated, agonizing knot. A part of her hated him with a quiet intensity. He was the architect of her misery, the silent jailer in her desolate prison. His very presence was a constant reminder of her fall from grace, of the life of gentle respectability that had been stolen from her. His silence felt like a judgment, his indifference a deliberate cruelty. He had married her, brought her to this wasteland, and then discarded her, leaving her to fend for herself in a world for which she was utterly unprepared. And yet, underneath the anger, a reluctant curiosity took root and began to grow. He was an enigma, a puzzle she couldn't help but try to solve. Though he kept his distance, he was not unkind. She noticed the small things. When she struggled to lift a particularly heavy log for the fire, she would turn away in frustrated tears. And when she looked back, a pile of perfectly sized kindling would be waiting by the door. One afternoon, the handle of the water bucket broke, sending her tumbling to the ground and spilling the precious water into the thirsty dust. She had sat there and wept with sheer, unadulterated despair. She never heard him approach, but when she finally looked up, he was there, wordlessly handing her the bucket, its handle now expertly repaired with a strip of cured leather. He never acknowledged her tears or her failure. He simply saw a problem and fixed it. His help was always like that, silent, precise, and impersonal. He was a ghost who mended things in her wake. This strange, detached care was maddening. It offered no comfort, only confusion. Clara found herself watching him, studying the way he moved, the set of his jaw, the quiet competence in his hands. He was a man of profound stillness, yet he was never idle. Who was this man who worked from sunup to sundown to maintain a life of such stark poverty? What thoughts moved behind those quiet, winter-gray eyes? The less he offered of himself, the more desperately she wanted to know. Her desire to be more than a prisoner on this patch of rock and dust led her to the corral. If she could ride, she could at least have the freedom of the land. She could escape the claustrophobic confines of the shack, if only for an hour. She watched Eli with his horses, saw the strange, gentle language he seemed to share with them, a soft murmur, a light touch on the neck that could calm the most skittish animal. One morning, she took a deep breath and approached him as he groomed a placid-looking sorrel mare. "I want to learn to ride," she announced, her voice sounding small and brittle in the vast quiet. Eli stopped brushing and turned to look at her. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her simple dress and worn shoes. She expected him to refuse, to dismiss the idea as foolish. Instead, he gave a single, curt nod. "This one's gentle. Her name is Daisy." His instruction was as sparse as his conversation. He showed her how to saddle the mare, how to hold the reins, how to mount. His hands brushed hers as he adjusted her grip, and a jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up her arm. He pulled his hand back as if he, too, had felt it. He then stepped away, leaving her alone atop the powerful animal. The world looked different from up there, wider and more open. A flicker of something akin to hope ignited within her. She spent the next hour walking Daisy around the inside of the corral, getting the feel of the horse's gentle rhythm. Emboldened, she urged the mare into a slow trot. It was exhilarating. A laugh, a genuine, unburdened sound, escaped her lips for the first time in months. And then it happened. A rattlesnake, sunning itself by the fence, sounded its dry, terrifying warning. Daisy shied violently. A sudden, sideways leap of pure instinct. Clara, unprepared and unskilled, was thrown. The world became a dizzying, terrifying blur of blue sky and red earth, ending with a hard, breath-stealing impact that knocked the world into darkness. When her senses returned, it was in fragments. The smell of dust, a throbbing pain in the back of her head, and the feeling of being held. She was not on the ground. She was in Eli's arms, being carried toward the shack. His arms were like bands of steel around her, holding her so tightly against his chest that she could feel the frantic, desperate hammering of his heart. Or was it her own? One of his hands was tangled in her hair, cradling her head, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her scalp. A low, guttural sound was coming from his throat, a sound of raw, ragged fear. She had never seen him move so fast, never felt such ferocious energy from him. For that one, suspended moment, as he carried her across the yard, he was not a silent, indifferent stranger. He was a man terrified of losing something precious. Her eyelids fluttered open. She looked up and met his gaze. His face, inches from hers, was a maelstrom of emotion, fear, relief, and something else, something deeper and more intense that she couldn't name. The world seemed to stop. And then, the moment he saw the awareness in her eyes, it shattered. The mask of indifference slammed back into place. The fire in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by the familiar cool gray. He immediately loosened his grip, and by the time they reached the shack, he was setting her gently on her feet, his touch becoming impersonal and functional once more. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "My head," she whispered, feeling dizzy. He guided her to the bed and made her lie down. His examination was swift and clinical, his fingers probing the back of her skull for lumps or bleeding, finding none. He fetched a wet cloth and placed it on her forehead, and that was it. He retreated to the far side of the room, his back to her, leaving her alone with the phantom sensation of his arms around her and the wild, thunderous echo of his heart. Clara lay there for hours, her body aching, but her mind in turmoil. She was touched, shaken to her very core, by the raw, protective force she had felt in him. He cared. He might hide it behind a wall of silence, but he cared what happened to her. The realization sent a warm, confusing wave through her, but it was immediately followed by a cold, angry tide of resentment. If he cared, why did he treat her like a ghost? Why the relentless distance? Men, she had been taught, were creatures of appetite. Her friends, before her marriage, had spoken in giggles and whispers about the looks they received from cowboys in town, looks of open, hungry desire. Eli never looked at her like that. He barely looked at her at all. That desperate embrace by the corral was the only time he had held her, and he had released her as if she were made of hot coals. The thought was a humiliation. Did he find her so plain, so undesirable, that he felt no stirring of a husband's needs? Was she to be not only a drudge, but an unwanted one at that? The conflict tore at her, leaving her feeling both deeply moved and bitterly wounded. A week later, the sky, which had been a relentless sheet of blue for months, turned a bruised, angry purple. A storm rolled in from the west, a monstrous, churning wall of black clouds that swallowed the sun. The wind shrieked, and the rain began not as drops, but as a solid, wind-driven sheet that hammered against the shack. Eli was caught outside, trying to herd the last of the horses into the relative safety of a three-sided shelter. Clara watched from the window as he fought against the storm, a lone, stubborn figure battling the elements. The wind tore at his clothes and the rain plastered his hair to his head, but he moved with a steady, unyielding resolve. Finally, the last horse was secured, and he made a run for the shack, bursting through the door in a spray of water and a gust of cold wind. He was soaked to the bone, his shirt clinging to his body like a second skin. Water dripped from his hair and ran in rivulets down his face. Without a word to her, he went to a small trunk in the corner and pulled out a dry shirt and trousers. He retreated behind a makeshift partition, a threadbare blanket hung over a rope that offered the barest illusion of privacy. The storm raged outside, and a particularly violent clap of thunder shook the small shack to its foundations, making the window pane rattle furiously in its frame, fearing it would break. Clara rushed toward it. In her haste, her path took her past the edge of the hanging blanket, and she saw him. It was only for a second, a single, stolen glance, but the image was seared into her mind. He was turned away from her, stripped to the waist, reaching for the dry shirt. The firelight played over the muscles of his back and shoulders, all lean, ropey strength, the body of a man honed by relentless physical labor. It was a sight of stark, powerful masculinity, the likes of which her sheltered eyes had never seen. But it wasn't just his strength that made her gasp and freeze. It was the scars. His skin was a roadmap of a violent, painful history. A long, puckered white line ran diagonally across his ribs, the remnant of a terrible knife wound. Another scar, a messy, starburst-shaped tangle of tissue, marred the perfection of his left shoulder blade. There were other, smaller marks, faded and silver, hints of other battles, other pains. These were not the scars of a farmer or a ranch hand. These were the scars of a fighter, of a man who had known a world of violence she could not begin to comprehend. In that frozen instant, something deep within her shifted. What she felt was not revulsion or fear. It was a sudden, shocking jolt of heat that started low in her belly and spread through her limbs like wildfire. It was a dizzying, terrifying feeling, a raw, physical yearning that was completely alien to her. She wanted to trace the lines of those scars with her fingertips. She wanted to know the stories they told. The thought was so immediate, so powerful. It horrified her. It was sinful. It was wanton. Shame, hot and absolute, washed over her. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. She fled to her bed, her back to the partition, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard him finish dressing, heard the soft rustle of cloth, but she did not turn. She felt branded by what she had seen. by what she had felt. Later that night, the storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a sky full of brilliant, cold stars. But the tempest inside Clara had not subsided. She lay on her cot, feigning sleep, listening to the sound of Eli's steady breathing from his pallet on the floor on the other side of the room. The image of his scarred back was burned into the back of her eyelids. The memory of that strange, forbidden heat still pulsed within her. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand and couldn't fight, she slipped silently from her bed. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet. She crept to the edge of the main room, her body hidden in the deep shadows cast by the hearth. Moonlight, pure and white, streamed through the window, falling directly on him. He slept on his side, one arm thrown over his head. The moonlight silvered the edges of his dark hair and traced the powerful line of his shoulder. He looked younger in sleep. The harsh lines of his face softened, the unyielding tension gone from his body. He looked vulnerable. Clara stood there for a long time, watching him breathe. The hatred she had felt for him seemed a distant, childish thing. The anger at his indifference was still there, but it was now complicated by this new, dangerous tenderness. She saw him not as her jailer, not as the symbol of her ruin, but as a man, a solitary, wounded man who held his secrets and his pain as close as his own skin. And as she watched him sleep, the strange, forbidden yearning returned. No longer a shocking jolt, but a slow, warm, and deeply troubling ache in the center of her chest. Her world had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer just a frightened girl. In the moonlit silence of that shack, staring at the back of her silent husband, a woman was beginning to awaken. More than 2 months had passed, 2 months of silent days and lonely nights. The rhythm of the homestead had become a familiar, if not comforting, metronome marking the passage of her empty life. One Tuesday, their supplies of flour and salt had dwindled to almost nothing. The trip to Dust Creek was unavoidable. Eli announced it that morning, his words as spare as always. "We need provisions. Be ready in an hour." The thought of returning to town filled Clara with a cold, creeping dread. The town represented everything she had lost: community, friendship, respectability. Now, it was a place of judgment, a gallery of hostile faces that would see her only as the girl who had been married off to the silent man from the canyon. She put on her best dress, the same faded blue she had been married in, and tied her hair with a plain ribbon. A pathetic attempt to arm herself with a shred of dignity. The journey was as silent as ever. The only sound the clop of the horses' hooves and the squeal of the wagon wheels. As they approached the main street, Clara could feel the eyes of the town upon them. She saw women stop sweeping their porches to stare. Men pause their conversations to watch them pass. She shrank down on the wagon seat, wishing she could become invisible. Eli pulled up in front of the general store and, without a word, got down and hitched the horses. He handed her a small, worn leather pouch with a few coins in it. "Get what you need. I have business at the smithy." He turned and walked away, his long, lonely strides eating up the dusty ground, leaving her utterly alone to face the gauntlet. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and gossip. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, gave her a look that was a mixture of pity and sharp-eyed curiosity. As Clara gathered her flour, sugar, and beans, she felt the weight of hushed whispers from the other women in the store. She kept her eyes down, her face burning with shame. Just as she was paying, a voice she had once cherished called her name. "Clara May, is that really you?" Clara turned to see Sarah Jenkins, a girl she had grown up with, a friend from her old life. Sarah was pretty, dressed in a new calico dress, her face full of lively, careless confidence. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over Clara, a friendly face. But that relief was short-lived. "Goodness, child, you look weathered," Sarah said, her eyes doing a swift, critical inventory of Clara's plain dress and work-roughened hands. The words were couched in concern, but the tone was pure condescension. This homesteading life must be terribly hard, but I suppose a husband makes it all worthwhile. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper laced with malice. Tell me, has that silent husband of yours managed to tame you yet, or does he remain as quiet in the bedroom as he is on the street? The question, so blunt and so cruel, struck Clara like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face. Sarah's eyes glittered with the thrill of her own audacity. The other women in the store fell silent, their ears straining to catch Clara's response. She had no response. She could only stare, her mouth dry, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Sarah laughed, a high, brittle sound. Oh, dear, still a blushing bride after all this time. I suppose some men just lack the proper tools for the job. She patted Clara's arm in a gesture of false sympathy. You poor thing. Clara fled. She left her change on the counter, grabbed her parcels, and stumbled out into the blinding sunlight, her cheeks flaming with a humiliation so profound it felt like it was scorching her from the inside out. The whispers followed her into the street, no longer hushed, but buzzing like angry hornets. She saw it in the smirks of the men lounging outside the saloon, in the knowing glances exchanged between women across the street. The rumor was alive, a venomous, fast-spreading sickness. Eli Kane, the ghost of the canyon, was impotent. He didn't know how to be a husband, and Clara, his wife, was a damaged article, a virgin bride no man had claimed, her innocence now a mark of shame instead of virtue. The ride home was an eternity of silent torture. Clara sat rigid, replaying Sarah's words, feeling the sting of the town's collective scorn. She looked at the man beside her, at his strong hands on the reins, at the impassive line of his jaw. Was it true? Was he incapable? Or was she so utterly undesirable that he felt nothing for her? Which was worse? Both possibilities were a fresh and exquisitely painful kind of hell. That evening, a storm broke, the same kind of violent, angry squall that had torn through the prairie weeks before. But this time, the storm was inside Clara. The shame and hurt had curdled into a reckless, desperate anger. She watched Eli mend a piece of tack by the firelight, his movements as calm and methodical as ever, his silence an impenetrable wall. She couldn't bear it another minute. She remembered seeing him, on rare occasions, take a small flask from his saddlebag and pour a measure of amber liquid into his coffee, while he was outside checking on the horses, her hands shaking. She searched for it. She found a stone bottle tucked away in the small, rickety barn, half full of cheap, fiery whiskey. She had never tasted spirits in her life. Her mother had taught her it was the devil's brew, but tonight she needed its fire. She poured a generous amount into a tin cup and drank it down. The liquor burned a path down her throat and exploded in her stomach. A shocking, spreading heat. It made her head swim and her legs feel unsteady, but it also burned away the edges of her fear, replacing it with a hot, reckless courage. Fueled by the whiskey and a heart full of anguish, she made her decision. She went to her small bundle of belongings and pulled out the simple white nightgown she had sewn for her trousseau, a garment she had never worn. It was made of thin cotton, almost translucent in the firelight. She shed her heavy dress and pulled the nightgown over her head, her hair, usually in a tight, sensible bun. She unpinned, letting it fall in a dark cascade over her shoulders. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of terror and defiance. She took another swallow of whiskey, the fire giving her strength. Then she walked out of the shadows and stood before him. Eli looked up from his work, his hands stilling. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the sight of her, the white gown, the loose hair, the feverish, challenging look in her eyes. The air in the shack grew thick, charged with a sudden, dangerous electricity. "What is this, Clara?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She walked closer, her bare feet silent on the packed earth floor, until she was standing directly in front of him. She could smell the whiskey on her own breath, feel its heat on her skin. 2 months, Eli, she said, her voice shaking but clear. 2 months I have been your wife. The women in town, they laugh at me. They whisper. They say you are not a man. They say I'm a bride no husband wants. She saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of pain so raw it stole her breath. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a hard, guarded stillness. What the town says is no concern of ours, he said, his voice flat. It is my concern, she cried, the words tearing from her throat. It is my shame. I will not be your ghost of a wife in this ghost of a house any longer. She took a final, trembling step forward, her body almost touching his. She tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze with all the desperate, whiskey-fueled bravado she could muster. Prove them wrong. Touch me. Be my husband, if you are a man at all. The challenge hung in the air between them, ugly and desperate. She expected something, a flicker of desire, a moment of hesitation, perhaps even a rough embrace. She was prepared for him to take what she offered, to finally consummate the marriage that had been a sham for so long. What she was not prepared for was the rage. It didn't erupt in a shout. It was a silent, terrifying transformation. The stillness in him coalesced into something as hard and dangerous as granite. His face became a mask of cold fury. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. He rose to his feet, not with the movements of a lover, but with the explosive grace of a predator. He loomed over her, a dark and intimidating shadow. For the first time, Clara felt a true, primal fear of him. But he didn't touch her. He looked at her, and his eyes were not filled with lust, but with a deep, burning anger and an even deeper, more profound hurt. He looked at her as if she had just plunged a knife into his gut. Is that what you think I am? He finally ground out, his voice low and guttural, vibrating with a suppressed violence. An animal in a stall, to be goaded and tested. You think your honor is a thing I can restore by rutting on you like a beast? With a roar of pure, frustrated anguish, he spun away from her and slammed his fist down on the rough wooden table. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. The tin cup on the table jumped and clattered to the floor. Clara flinched back. A cry of terror caught in her throat. And then, as quickly as it had come, the violent energy was gone. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders heaving, his head bowed. He looked at his own trembling, bruised hand on the table as if it belonged to a stranger. Without another word, without another look at her, he strode to the door, wrenched it open, and walked out into the howling wind and driving rain of the storm. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Clara alone in the sudden, ringing silence. The defiant courage the whiskey had given her evaporated, leaving behind a cold, nauseating residue of shame and regret. She stood there, trembling in her thin nightgown, the cold of the room seeping into her bones. Then a sob, a great, wrenching thing, tore its way up from the depths of her soul, and she collapsed onto her bed, burying her face in the pillow, and wept. She cried for her lost life, for her humiliation in the town, for the failure of her desperate gamble. But most of all, she cried because of the look in his eyes. It was not the look of a man rejecting a woman he did not desire. It was the look of a man who had been profoundly, deeply insulted by the one person whose opinion might have mattered. She had offered him her body to solve a problem of pride, and in doing so, she had treated him not as a man, but as a thing, and he, the silent outcast, had furiously, righteously rejected the insult. Lying there in the dark, with the storm raging outside and the sound of her own sobs filling the room, Clara began to ask herself questions she had never considered before. What did it mean to be a man? Was it merely the exercise of physical power, the satisfaction of an appetite? Her mother, the church, the gossiping women in town, They all seemed to think so, but Eli's anger suggested something else entirely. His restraint, which she had mistaken for indifference or inability, was a choice, a deliberate, willed act. It was a form of gentleness so foreign to her understanding of the world that she had been unable to see it. It was a gentleness that was stronger, she was beginning to realize, than any brute force. The next day dawned gray and sullen, the world outside a sea of mud. Eli did not return to the shack. Clara saw him from the window, working in the corral. His movements stiff, his face set like stone. The distance between them was now a vast, unbridgeable chasm. Later that afternoon, needing to escape the suffocating confines of the shack, she rode Daisy into town. She had to face the whispers again, but it seemed a lesser punishment than the silence of the homestead. As she approached the main street, she saw a commotion near the blacksmith's shop. A crowd had gathered, their voices raised in alarm. A big freight wagon, its horses spooked by a stray dog, had bolted. The driver was sawing at the reins, shouting, but the heavy wagon was careening down the street, a runaway engine of wood and iron. People scrambled out of the way, women screaming and pulling their children to safety. And then, a small boy, no more than 4 or 5, toddled out from between 2 buildings, directly into the path of the thundering horses. A collective gasp of horror rose from the crowd. The boy's mother shrieked his name, frozen in terror. It was all happening too fast. No one could possibly reach him in time. And then, a figure moved. It was Eli. He had been at the smithy, and he moved from the shadows of the building not with a panicked rush, but with an incredible, focused speed. He didn't run at the horses head-on. He ran parallel to them, his long legs eating up the ground, and in a single, fluid motion of breathtaking athleticism, he launched himself through the air, grabbing the bridle of the lead horse. His weight on its head, combined with a sharp, commanding shout, was enough to break the animal's panic. The horse swerved, fighting him, its hooves churning the mud inches from the frozen child. Eli held on, his boots sliding in the muck, his body a shield between the boy and the tons of iron and horseflesh. He spoke to the animal, not in shouts, but in a low, calming murmur. The same voice he used with his own skittish colts. Slowly, miraculously, the team of horses slowed, their sides heaving, their panic subsiding under the force of his will and the calm authority in his voice. The wagon shuddered to a halt. The world, which had been a blur of chaotic motion, fell silent. Eli, still holding the bridle, stood breathing heavily, his clothes splattered with mud. The little boy, snapping out of his trance, began to cry. His mother ran to him, sobbing with relief, snatching him up in her arms. For the first time since Clara had known him, the town of Dust Creek was looking at Eli Kane, and they were not looking at him with pity or contempt. They were looking at him with awe. The sheriff pushed through the crowd, clapping a hand on Eli's shoulder. The freight driver, pale and shaking, stammered his thanks. The boy's mother, tears streaming down her face, looked at him as if he were an angel sent from heaven. "You saved my boy," she whispered. "God bless you, sir." Eli simply nodded, his face unreadable. He released the horse's bridle, turned away from the praise and the astonished looks, and walked back toward the smithy as if nothing had happened, disappearing once more into the shadows. Clara sat on her horse at the edge of the street, her heart pounding. She had just witnessed it, the truth of him. Not a failure, not a ghost, but a man of incredible strength, courage, and quiet capability. A man who acted while others stood frozen in fear. That evening, the silence in the shack was different. It was no longer angry, but heavy with unspoken things. They ate their meal of beans and cornbread separately, as usual. But Clara couldn't swallow a bite. When they were finished, she took a deep breath. "Eli." He was cleaning his knife, and he paused, but didn't look at her. "I am sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For last night. What I said, what I did, it was wrong. I was shamed by the town, and I tried to use you to fix my own pride. I was cruel. I am sorry." He finished cleaning his knife, slid it into its sheath, and was silent for a long time. Clara held her breath, expecting him to say nothing, to simply walk away and leave her with her apology hanging in the dead air. Finally, he turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes were clear and steady, and the anger was gone, replaced by that deep, bone-weary sadness she had seen on their wedding night. "I didn't pay your father's debts to own you, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "I did it because he was a decent man who fell on hard times, and because your mother left you no other choice. I am keeping my distance from you not because I am weak, or because I find you wanting—" He paused, and his gaze was so intense she felt it like a physical touch. "I am doing it because you deserve the dignity of a choice. Marriage was forced on you. What happens in the marriage bed should not be, it should be a gift, freely given. Not a duty, or a debt, or a cure for town gossip." His words struck her with the force of a physical revelation. All of her assumptions, all of her fears, all of her mother's bitter lessons, they all crumbled to dust in the face of his quiet, revolutionary declaration. He wasn't rejecting her. He was honoring her. He was protecting an innocence in her that she herself had been ready to cast away for the sake of pride. A tear slid down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness or shame. It was a tear of profound, shattering understanding. For the first time since she had arrived at the desolate homestead, he gestured to the stool opposite him at the small table. It was an invitation. Hesitantly, she sat down. For the first time, they sat facing each other, not as strangers bound by a loveless contract, but as two people alone in the vast, empty wilderness. The fire crackled in the hearth. The silence returned, but it was no longer an enemy. It was a space, a quiet clearing where something new and fragile might now have the chance to grow. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment longer than a moment, they held the gaze, and in that look, a silent promise was made to begin again. The fragile truce forged between them was tested not by whispers or pride, but by the sky itself. The summer that followed their silent understanding was born without mercy. The sun rose each day not as a source of life, but as a brassy, malevolent eye in a bleached white sky. The rains, which should have come in gentle waves through June and July, simply ceased. The sky forgot how to weep. This was no ordinary dry spell. It was a drought, a slow, relentless strangulation of the land. The creek that gave the town its name became a cracked, muddy scar. The prairie grasses, once a sea of green, turned to a brittle, yellowed thatch that crunched underfoot like dry bones. The wind, which had always been a constant companion, now carried only dust and the scent of death. It was a hot, searing breath that stole the moisture from the soil, the leaves, and the very skin of those who toiled beneath it. For Clara and Eli, the drought became a third person in their marriage, a silent, ravenous entity that consumed their days and haunted their nights. Their small well grew shallower. The water they drew tasting of mud and minerals. The vegetable patch Clara had so painstakingly planted withered. The young shoots scorched black before they had a chance to grow. Life became a desperate, elemental struggle for the most basic necessity, water. They worked together, a silent, synchronized team. In the cool of the pre-dawn, they would haul bucket after bucket from the well, giving a meager, carefully rationed drink to the horses and pouring the rest into a covered barrel for themselves. The rest of the day was a battle against the sun, reinforcing the shade shelter for the animals, patching the roof of the shack to keep out the suffocating heat. The silence between them was no longer awkward or angry. It was the shared, weary quiet of soldiers in a long and losing war. The horses were the first to truly suffer. Eli's small herd, already thin, grew gaunt. Their ribs stood out like the slats of a broken barrel. Their heads hung low, their eyes dull with a permanent, thirsty misery. Eli spent his days ranging farther and farther, searching for any patch of surviving grama grass, returning each evening with his face etched with failure. One evening, he returned to the shack not with his horses, but with a small pouch heavy with coin. Clara looked at him, a question in her eyes. "I sold them," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "All but Daisy and my gelding, Samson. Sold them to a rancher down south, where there's still water in the river." Clara stared at him, her heart aching. His horses were the only thing of value he owned, the only real remnant of his life as a free-ranging cowboy. They were his pride, his work, his companions in this vast loneliness. He had sold them. "Why?" she whispered. He untied the pouch and poured its contents onto the small table. A handful of silver dollars and a few gold coins gleamed in the lamplight. "For this," he said, pushing a single gold eagle toward her. "This is for seed, corn and wheat. If the rains come in the fall, we can plant. If we have no seed, it won't matter if it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. We'll have nothing." He had sold his past for a chance at their future. The weight of his sacrifice settled in the small room, a tangible thing. He was betting everything they had on the hope of rain, on the hope of a life together on this harsh piece of land. With the money from the other horses, they bought what they needed to survive: flour, beans, salted pork. But the most precious commodity, water, could not be bought. The well was now yielding little more than a few buckets of sludge a day. Their barrel was almost empty. "I'll go," Clara said one morning, her voice resolute. "The McGregor farm is only 5 miles east. They have a deep well, fed by a spring. Maybe they'll spare some." Eli looked at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "They're proud people. Clara, they might not take kindly to charity." "We are not asking for charity," she said, her own pride rising to the surface. "We are neighbors in need. It is the Christian thing to do." The next day, she set out on Daisy. 2 empty barrels strapped to a small cart Eli had fashioned. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down on her head and shoulders. The heat radiated up from the cracked earth in shimmering waves. By the time she reached the McGregor farm, her dress was soaked with sweat and her head was pounding. Mrs. McGregor, a stern, sun-weathered woman with eyes the color of faded denim, met her at the door. Clara explained their situation, her voice polite and steady, though her throat was painfully dry. The woman's face remained a mask of stone. "We have our own family to think of," she said, her voice as dry as the land around them. "Every bucket we draw is one less for our own stock, our own children. We have nothing to spare for those who can't manage their own affairs." Clara flinched as if struck. "We are willing to pay—" "We don't need your money, Mrs." McGregor snapped. Then her eyes narrowed with a familiar, cruel light. "I heard about you, the girl from town who married the canyon ghost. Thought you'd play the grand lady on his homestead. Did you? This is a hard life, girl. It's for hard people. Maybe you should have thought of that before you hitched your wagon to a no-account drifter." The words were a brutal echo of the town's scorn, a confirmation that her shame had followed her out into the desolate prairie. Humiliation washed over Clara, hot and sickening. She wanted to turn and flee, to hide her face and weep. But then she thought of Eli. She thought of the horses he had sold, of the quiet, desperate hope in his eyes when he spoke of the seed grain. Her shame was a luxury she could not afford. She straightened her back and looked Mrs. McGregor directly in the eye. "My husband is a good man, and he is a hard worker," she said, her voice low and trembling, but clear. "The drought is God's will, not a failure of his character. I am asking for water, ma'am, not your judgment." For a moment, the older woman looked taken aback by her defiance, but her face hardened once more. She turned and went back inside, slamming the door. Clara stood there for a long moment, the rejection a bitter pill in her throat. Defeated. She turned to leave, but the door opened again. Mr. McGregor, a quiet man who lived in his wife's shadow, stood there. He didn't look at Clara. He looked out at the parched fields, his face a mask of weary resignation. "1 barrel," he muttered, not looking at her. "Just one. Don't tell the missus." It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She hauled her single barrel of precious water back across the 5 miles of sun-baked hell, feeling every single jolt of the cart in her aching bones. This became her new reality. Every other day, she would make the journey, sometimes to the McGregor farm, sometimes to other homesteads, facing down suspicion, scorn, and the occasional grudging act of charity. She was the beggar bride, the young woman married to the poor cowboy. The insults and the pitying looks were a constant assault on her pride. But with each trip, a hard, resilient shell began to form around her heart. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Eli. She was fighting for them. But the fight was taking its toll. The relentless sun, the grueling physical labor, and the constant stress were wearing her down. She grew thin, her skin perpetually burned by the sun despite her bonnet, and dark, bruised circles appeared beneath her eyes. One sweltering afternoon, on the journey back from a particularly cruel rejection at the hands of a farmer who had sicked his dogs on her, the world began to tilt and swim. The horizon blurred. The pounding in her head grew to a deafening roar. She clung to Daisy's saddle, trying to stay conscious, but a gray, suffocating fog rolled in, and she knew no more. She awoke in pieces. The world was a confusing collage of sensations: coolness on her forehead, the soft scratch of the blanket against her cheek, a low, murmuring voice that seemed to come from far away. She was in the shack. She was in her bed. But how? She drifted in and out of consciousness for what felt like an eternity. In her moments of lucidity, she saw him. Eli was always there. He sat in a stool beside her bed, a constant, silent sentinel. She saw him dipping a rag in a basin of precious water and gently bathing her face and neck. She felt him lift her head and press a cup of cool broth to her lips, coaxing her to drink. She heard him moving about the shack in the dead of night, adding wood to the fire, his movements unnaturally quiet. During the long, fever-haunted nights, her dreams were a terrifying landscape of fire and thirst. She would cry out, thrashing in the sweat-soaked sheets, and a firm, gentle hand would take hers, holding on until the terror passed. She was too weak to speak, too lost in the fever's grip to fully understand. But through the haze of sickness, one truth penetrated. He was not leaving her side. He was her anchor in a burning, churning sea. After what she later learned was nearly a week, the fever finally broke. She woke late one night, her body drenched in a clean sweat, the fire in her blood extinguished. The shack was dark, save for the soft orange glow of the embers in the hearth. Her head was clear for the first time in days. She felt weak, as fragile as a piece of spun glass, but she was alive. Eli was asleep in the stool, his head slumped forward onto his chest, his face haggard with exhaustion in the dim light. His hand was resting on the edge of her bed, inches from her own. Even in sleep, he had stayed close. A wave of emotion so powerful it was painful washed over her. He had cared for her. He had used their desperately needed water to cool her fever. He had nursed her, watched over her, and pulled her back from the brink. All the silent days, all the lonely nights, all the pride and misunderstanding that had stood between them seemed to melt away in the face of this simple, profound truth. A shudder ran through her, a tremor of weakness and cold. She needed. She reached out, her fingers barely brushing his. "Eli?" she whispered, her voice a dry, hoarse rasp. His eyes snapped open. He was instantly awake, instantly alert. "Clara, are you—" "I'm cold," she breathed, her teeth chattering. It was more than a physical chill. It was a deep, soul-level cold, the lingering echo of the fever's shadow. She looked at him, all her defenses gone, her pride stripped away, leaving only a raw and vulnerable need. "Please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Hold me, just once. Please hold me." He stared at her, his face a conflict of emotions. He saw the plea in her eyes, the genuine, desperate need for comfort. Slowly, as if afraid she might break, he rose from the stool and sat on the edge of the bed. He hesitated for only a second. Then he slid his strong arms around her and gently drew her against his chest. The moment his arms closed around her, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her lips. She was so weak she could barely hold her own head up. But she leaned into him, burying her face in the rough, clean fabric of his shirt. He was solid. He was warm. He smelled of wood smoke and earth and Eli. He was real. She felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek, a rhythm that was at once calming and deeply stirring. He held her carefully, one hand spread across her back, the other gently cradling her head. It was not the desperate, frantic embrace of the day she had fallen from the horse. This was a different kind of hold, infinitely tender, infinitely protective. He was holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. And as she lay there in his arms, safe and warm for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, something else awakened within her. Amid the profound comfort, a new sensation uncoiled, a slow, liquid heat that had nothing to do with her fever. It was an intense, shocking awareness of him. She felt the strength in the arms that held her, the hardness of the muscles in his chest, the warmth of his skin through the thin cotton of her nightgown, the purely physical reality of him. The man she had desired and feared and misunderstood flooded her senses. It was a feeling so powerful, so deeply intimate, it was dizzying. In the heart of their shared suffering, a fierce and undeniable desire was born. He held her in silence for a long time. She felt a tremor run through his own body, felt the slight tensing of his muscles, and knew that he was not immune to the moment. He was not a man made of stone. He felt it, too. He shifted slightly, and she thought, with a thrill that was equal parts terror and hope, that he might lower his head, that he might kiss her. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He gently pushed her back, just enough to look at her face in the dim light. His gray eyes were dark with an emotion she couldn't decipher. Then, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of benediction, a kiss of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. It was a promise of protection, a seal of devotion, an acknowledgement of everything they had become to one another. Then he pulled away. A single, heartbroken sob escaped her. She didn't understand. She didn't understand why that gentle, chaste kiss could shatter her more completely than any act of passion. She didn't understand why his restraint felt like both the greatest gift and the most painful rejection she had ever known. Tears began to stream down her face, hot and silent. She wasn't crying from sadness or frustration, but from an overwhelming, incomprehensible wave of emotion that had no name. He didn't leave. He simply lay down on the blanket beside her, on top of the covers, and once more gathered her into his arms. He held her while she cried, his hand stroking her hair, his presence a solid, unwavering comfort in the dark. He didn't offer words, because words were not what she needed. He offered himself, his warmth, his strength, and cradled in his arms, Clara finally fell into a deep, dreamless, healing sleep. She awoke to the pale gray light of dawn filtering through the window. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then she realized two things. First, she felt, well, the weakness was still there, but the sickness was gone. Second, she was not alone. She was still in Eli's arms. Sometime during the night, he had gathered her close, and they had slept like that, her head pillowed on his shoulder, his arms securely around her waist. She lay perfectly still, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his chest. The morning was quiet, the world hushed and expectant. She slowly lifted her head and looked at his face. In the soft light of dawn, he looked peaceful, the lines of hardship and worry erased by sleep. This man, this silent stranger, had become her anchor, her protector, her nurse. He had become her home. And for the first time since she had arrived in this desolate, lonely place, a genuine, unburdened smile touched Clara's lips. Their relationship had been transformed. The wall of silence and distance between them had been irrevocably breached. They were no longer two strangers living in the same small space. They were partners, bound by the shared crucible of hardship and a new, unspoken tenderness. He still slept on his pallet on the floor, and the physical line between them was still drawn, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a space of mutual, quiet respect. Their life was still a struggle against the merciless sun and the thirsty earth, but they were no longer struggling alone. They were struggling together. The new tenderness between them was a fragile plant in a hostile land. It needed time and peace to grow, but the world had little of either to offer. The drought did not break, and their struggle continued. A daily grind of hauling water, conserving food, and watching the sky with the aching, desperate hope. It was during this period of grueling hardship that a new and even more insidious poison began to seep into their lives from the town of Dust Creek. The rumor began, as rumors do, with a whisper and a sideways glance. Clara's collapse during the drought, a story that had filtered back to town on the lips of a farmer she had begged for water, was the seed. Her subsequent weakness, the natural result of exhaustion and poor nutrition, was the fertile ground. One morning, after drinking from their nearly empty barrel, a wave of nausea sent her retching behind the shack. It was a simple sickness from bad water, but in the malicious imagination of the town, it was something else entirely. Sarah Jenkins was the one who gave the rumor its voice. "Poor Clara," she was heard to say at the general store, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "First, she's married to a man who can't perform his duties, and now she's suddenly with child? One has to wonder who the real father is. A woman gets lonely out there in the dust." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same townsfolk who had whispered that Eli was impotent now whispered that Clara was an adulteress. The two rumors, utterly contradictory, existed simultaneously, because the town's contempt was not based on logic, but on a deep-seated need to condemn the outcasts. They had scorned Clara for her supposed barrenness. Now they scorned her for her supposed fecundity. She was a fallen woman, a tainted bride who had sought comfort outside her sham of a marriage. The whispers followed her on her rare, necessary trips to town, a cloud of buzzing, stinging insects from which there was no escape. It was this rumor, this new stain on their name, that brought the vulture. His name was Jedediah Sterling, a man who owned more land than anyone else in the county and whose soul was as barren as the drought-stricken earth. He was a man of appetites, for land, for money, for power, and he saw the drought not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. He had long coveted Eli's small plot of land. It was mostly rock and scrub, but it contained a deep, hidden ravine that Sterling suspected held a secret spring, a source of water that would be worth more than gold. He saw Eli and Clara's struggle, heard the town's rumors, and decided the time was right to move in for the kill. He came one afternoon when he knew Eli would be miles away, checking old, dried-up creek beds for any sign of water. Sterling rode up not on a workhorse, but on a magnificent black stallion whose coat gleamed with health. He was a large man, dressed in a fine leather vest and a clean white shirt, his face fleshy and smug. Clara saw him coming, and her heart went cold. She stood in the doorway of the shack, her hands clutching a dish rag, a silent, wary sentinel. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Kane," Sterling said, his voice a thick, oily drawl. He dismounted with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the very ground he stood on. "A hard time of it, I see." He gestured with a sweep of his hand at the parched garden, the empty corral. "We are managing," Clara said, her voice tight. "Are you?" Sterling chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. He took a step closer, his eyes roaming over her, taking in her thin frame and patched dress with an appraising, insolent gaze. "It doesn't look like managing to me. It looks like slow starvation. A pretty young thing like you, it's a crime to see you waste away out here. Especially now." He let his eyes drop pointedly to her flat stomach. "A woman in your condition needs proper nourishment." The insinuation was as foul as a stagnant pool. Clara's back went rigid. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," he purred, moving closer still, invading her space. "The whole town knows. A miracle, they're calling it, a child without a proper father. But a child needs a roof over its head. It needs food, things your husband can't seem to provide." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an apple, a perfect, gleaming red apple, in this parched, dying world. It looked like a jewel. He polished it on his sleeve and held it out to her. "This is what life could be like. Clara, a life with a real man. A man who can give you and your child a home, comfort, respect." Clara stared at the apple, then at his leering, predatory face. The offer was clear. He was trying to buy her child, to buy her land. He saw her as just another asset to be acquired, a distressed property to be snapped up for a bargain price. All the insults, all the hardships, all the lonely nights and grueling days, all the quiet, desperate love she had found with Eli, it all coalesced into a single, blinding flash of pure, incandescent rage. "Get off our land," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. Sterling's smile faltered. He was not used to being denied. "Now, don't be hasty, my dear. I'm making you a generous offer. Leave this failure of a man. Come with me. I'll take care of you. That shack will be a distant memory." "This shack," Clara said, her voice shaking with a fury she had never known she possessed, "is more of a home than any place you could ever offer me, and the man who lives here is 10 times the man you will ever be." Sterling's face darkened with anger. "You ungrateful little beggar. I'm offering you a lifeline and you spit in my face. You'll regret this when you're starving and he's crawling in the dust. You'll remember this day." He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out as if to grab her arm. That was his final mistake. Clara moved without thinking. Her hand, hardened by work and fueled by love and outrage, swung in a wide, fast arc. The sound of her palm connecting with his fleshy cheek was a sharp, satisfying crack that echoed in the preternatural quiet of the prairie. Sterling stumbled back, his hand flying to his face, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. A bright red handprint was already blooming on his skin. He stared at her, this thin, fierce girl who had dared to strike him. For a moment, she thought he would hit her back, but his shock was quickly replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. "You will pay for that, you little tramp," he snarled. He turned, swung himself onto his horse, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of accusatory red dust in his wake. Clara stood trembling, not with fear, but with the aftermath of her own rage. Then she turned and ran. She ran to the barn, saddled Daisy with frantic, fumbling hands, and rode out, searching for Eli. She found him miles away, a desolate figure standing by a dry riverbed. She galloped up to him, and the story came pouring out of her in a torrent of breathless, tearful words. She watched his face as she spoke. She saw the quiet concern shift to a dangerous stillness, saw his hands clench into tight, white-knuckled fists. But it was his eyes that frightened her. The weary sadness in them was burned away, replaced by a cold, gray fire, a lethal calm that was more terrifying than any shouting rage. When she finished, he said nothing. He simply reached out and gently touched the side of her face, as if assuring himself she was unharmed. Then he turned, swung himself onto Samson's back, and rode toward town. "Eli, no!" she cried, but he did not look back. He rode with a grim, relentless purpose, and Clara, her heart pounding with a terrible premonition, could only follow. He found Sterling holding court in the saloon, boasting to a group of his sycophants about the insolent little wife of the canyon ghost. Eli didn't enter through the swinging doors. He kicked them open. They flew inward, slamming against the walls, and a sudden, shocked silence fell over the room. Eli stood framed in the doorway, a figure of pure, righteous fury. He didn't say a word. He just walked toward Sterling's table. Sterling, flustered and half drunk, tried to rise. He never had the chance. Eli's fist shot out, a single, brutal blow that sent the larger man crashing backward over his chair, splintering the table. Eli was on him before he hit the ground. He hauled Sterling to his feet by the front of his fine vest and hit him again. And then again. It was not a barroom brawl. It was a methodical, terrifying punishment. Eli was silent, his face a mask of cold rage. Every blow delivered with a brutal efficiency that spoke of a dark and violent past. He was not fighting for land or for pride. He was fighting for Clara. He was fighting the man who had insulted her, threatened her, and treated her love as a thing to be bought. The saloon patrons, who had once scorned Eli, were now frozen in a mixture of fear and awe. Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose main job was to keep the peace for powerful men like Sterling, finally pushed his way through the crowd, his pistol drawn. "That's enough! Kane!" he yelled. "You'll kill him!" Eli seemed not to hear. He drew back his fist for another blow. It took the sheriff and 2 other men to pull him off the bloody, groaning form of Jedediah Sterling. Eli did not struggle against them. The fire in him seemed to die as quickly as it had ignited, leaving behind a man who was once again quiet, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw and bleeding. "You're under arrest, Kane," the sheriff said, snapping a pair of iron cuffs onto Eli's wrists. Eli didn't protest. He allowed himself to be led out of the saloon, past the stunned faces of the crowd, past Clara, who stood by the door, her face pale with horror and a fierce, terrible love. He did not look at her as they led him to the town's small, stone jail. He could not. The bail was set by a judge who was in Sterling's pocket. It was an astronomical sum, $500, an amount designed to be impossible. Sterling's plan was clear. Let Eli rot in jail while his lawyers and the drought worked together to steal his land. Clara was left alone, in a town that was now more hostile than ever. But despair was a luxury she could no longer afford. The timid girl was gone forever, burned away in the crucible of the past months. In her place was a woman fighting for her husband, for her home. She went back to the shack and tore apart her small chest of belongings. She took out the last 2 treasures from her old life. One was a delicate gold locket, a gift from her father, with a tiny, faded portrait of her mother inside. The other was a pair of simple pearl earrings, her grandmother's, which she was to have worn on her real wedding day. They were all she had left of the girl she used to be. She rode back to town and went to the general store. She did not look at the whispering women or the smirking men. She walked to the counter and placed the locket and the earrings in front of Mr. Gable. "How much?" she asked, her voice steady. The storekeeper, a man who dealt in pragmatism, examined them. He knew their value, and he knew her desperation. He offered her $20. It was a pittance, but it was all she was going to get. She took the money without haggling. It wasn't nearly enough. There was only one thing left to sell: her pride. She walked across the dusty street to the sheriff's office. She could see Eli through the barred window of his cell, a solitary figure staring at the far wall. Sheriff Brody was at his desk, doing paperwork. He looked up, annoyed. As she entered, "There's nothing you can do, ma'am. The law is the law. Bail is $500. I don't have it, Clara said. She put the $20 on his desk. This is all I have. Please, let him go. The sheriff scoffed. $20. Don't be ridiculous. Clara looked from the sheriff's dismissive face to Eli's rigid back in the cell. She thought of everything he had done for her. The blanket on their wedding night. The way he had held her when she was sick. The horses he had sold for their future. The kiss on her forehead. And she knew what she had to do. Slowly, deliberately. Clara sank to her knees on the dusty floorboards of the sheriff's office. She, Clara Mae Thompson, daughter of a respectable family, bowed her head before the law that had condemned her husband. Please, sir, she said, her voice breaking, the tears she had held back finally coming. Please, he is not a bad man. He was protecting me. He was protecting his wife. Is that not what a husband is supposed to do? Take this money. Let him work off the rest. Do anything, but please, don't leave him in there. Don't take my husband from me. He is all I have. Her words, and the raw, desperate humility of her posture, created a stunned silence in the room. The sheriff stared at her, his jaw slack. Even the deputy in the corner stopped his whittling. Through the bars of the cell, Eli had turned. He was watching her, his face a mask of utter, heart-shattering disbelief. He saw his wife, the girl he had tried so hard to protect, on her knees, begging for him. He saw the ultimate sacrifice, not of money or property, but of the very dignity he had fought so hard to preserve for her. The sheriff, for all his bluster, was a man of the town. He was not immune to a public spectacle. He could already hear the story being told, the story of the proud young wife on her knees for her husband. It was not a story that would make him look good. He cleared his throat, suddenly deeply uncomfortable. All right, get up, he grumbled, unable to meet her eyes. This is unseemly. He looked from Clara's tear-streaked face to the $20, then to the silent, watching man in the cell. He let out a long, weary sigh. Fine, he said. I'll count the $20 as a fine for disturbing the peace, but you get him out of my town. And if I see him lay a hand on Mr. Sterling again, I'll lock him up and throw away the key. You understand? Yes, Clara whispered, scrambling to her feet, wiping her eyes. Thank you. The sheriff unlocked the cell door. Eli stepped out. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked only at Clara. He walked toward her, and for the first time, she saw his walls, all his defenses, completely gone. In his eyes was a look of such profound, humbled love that it took her breath away. He saw what she had done for him, and in that moment, he understood the depth of her heart in a way that words could never convey. They walked out of the office and rode back to the homestead in a silence that was deeper and more profound than any they had ever shared. It was not a silence of distance, but of an overwhelming, heart-stopping intimacy. Everything had been stripped away. The town, the rumors, the pride, the fear. All that was left was the two of them. That night, a soft breeze finally blew in from the north, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of relief. The suffocating heat had broken. Inside the shack, the air was still and charged. After a simple meal they could barely eat. Eli sat by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought. Clara went behind the small partition. She took off her dusty dress. She took out the simple white cotton nightgown. The night she had last worn it. It had been a weapon, a desperate, whiskey-fueled challenge. Tonight, it was a sacrament. She let her hair down, letting it fall freely over her shoulders. She stepped out from behind the screen. Eli looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. She came to him and knelt on the floor in front of him, taking his bruised and battered hands in hers. She gently examined his split knuckles, her touch as soft as a prayer. "Let me," she whispered. She went to the basin and brought back a clean, damp cloth. and began to gently clean his wounds. She didn't say a word. Her actions said everything. "I am here. I choose you. I am yours." When she was finished, she looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. He looked down at her, and in his gaze, she saw all the longing, all the tenderness, all the fierce, protective love he had held back for so long. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Clara," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion that was close to reverence. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of brutal passion or pent-up hunger. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was slow and deep and exquisitely gentle. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of sorrow, of a love that had been forged in the harshest of fires. It was a kiss that healed. He lifted her in his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the bed. He laid her down gently and followed, his body covering hers, a warm, protective weight. This was not a submission. It was a union. It was the coming together of two lonely, wounded souls who had found in each other a reason to fight, a reason to hope, a reason to live. In the soft, flickering light of the fire, they shed the last of their pain, their loneliness, their fear, and gave themselves to one another completely, not in a desperate, frantic coupling, but in a slow, sacred act of love that was both a beginning and an end. The next morning, Clara awoke to the sound of a soft, steady drumming on the roof. Rain. The drought had broken. She was wrapped in Eli's arms, her head on his chest, their legs tangled together under the thin blanket. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She was home. Eli's arms tightened around her, and she knew he was awake. She tilted her head back and looked up at him. He was watching her, his gray eyes soft and full of a quiet, wondering joy. She smiled, a real radiant smile of pure happiness. "Now," she whispered, her voice full of a deep and settled certainty. "Now, I am truly your wife." The rain that broke the drought was a baptism. It washed the red dust from the air, darkened the thirsty soil to a rich, hopeful brown, and filled the silence with a music Clara had almost forgotten. In the weeks that followed, the prairie underwent a miracle of resurrection. A faint, tender green fuzz appeared on the scorched earth, which slowly deepened into a carpet of new grass. The sun was no longer an enemy, but a partner in the rebirth of the land. Inside the shack, a similar, quieter miracle was unfolding. The silence between Clara and Eli had been replaced by a new language, one of smiles, soft touches, and the easy rhythm of shared work. He would come in from the field he was now plowing, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, and she would meet him with a cool cup of water, her hand lingering on his arm as he drank. They talked. They spoke of the future, of the seeds he had bought with the price of his horses, of the foolishness of Jedediah Sterling, who had left town in disgrace after Eli's release. They spoke of everything and nothing, filling the small cabin not with noise, but with the warm, comforting hum of companionship. Their nights were a continuation of the day's quiet intimacy. Love, for them, was not a feverish, desperate thing, but a slow, deep, and reverent exploration. It was in the way he would brush a stray strand of hair from her face, the way she would trace the faded scars on his back, learning the map of his past with her fingertips. They were no longer two separate, lonely souls, but a single entity, a fortress of two against the harshness of the world. They were happy, and in the unforgiving landscape of the West, happiness was a dangerous, tempting thing for fate to notice. The trouble began not with a lack of water, but with an excess of fire. It started with a dry thunderstorm in late August, a series of angry, violet slashes of lightning from a sky that offered no rain. One of those bolts struck a dead cottonwood tree in the dry hills miles to the west. For a day, it smoldered, a tiny, insignificant spark, but the wind, The same hot, dry wind that had brought the drought was still there. It breathed on the ember, coaxing it, feeding it, until it awoke and became a monster. They smelled it before they saw it, a sharp, acrid scent of burning pine and dry grass on the wind. Then, the western horizon, which should have been a clear, pale blue, took on a dirty, yellowish-brown haze. By afternoon, the sun was a dull, orange disk in a sky the color of smoke and rust. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe, and a fine gray ash began to drift down like a perverse, unholy snow. Eli stood on the small rise behind their shack, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the west. "It's big," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and it's moving fast." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the bubble of their newfound peace. A wildfire was not like a drought, a slow, grinding enemy. It was a beast, a roaring, indiscriminate force of pure destruction that consumed everything in its path. There was no question of fighting it. Their only hope was to run. They worked with a frantic, silent efficiency born of their shared hardship. Clara packed a small bundle of food, their money pouch, and the locket from her father. Eli hitched Samson and Daisy to the wagon, throwing in his tools and a barrel of water. As they worked, the sound began, a low, distant roar, like a constant waterfall or a freight train that never passed. The sky was now a churning, terrifying ceiling of black and orange smoke, and the heat was a palpable presence, pressing in on them. They were not the only ones fleeing. As they joined the rough track that led toward the relative safety of the town, they saw other families, their wagons piled high with their most precious belongings, their faces masks of grim panic. The fire was no longer a distant threat. It was visible now, a line of leaping, ravenous orange flames devouring the hills, crowning the ridges with a terrible, fiery light. The town of Dust Creek was in chaos. People ran through the streets, shouting, their faces pale with terror. The fire was descending upon them, an army of flame that threatened to wipe the miserable little town from the face of the earth. The only hope was to reach the shallow, muddy river on the far side of town, to use it as a fire break. As Eli guided their wagon through the pandemonium, a cry of pure terror cut through the roar of the approaching flames. A heavy farm wagon, its axle broken, was stranded in the middle of the street. It belonged to the McGregors. Mrs. McGregor was frantically trying to unhitch the panicked horses while her husband fought to pull a heavy trunk from the back. Their young granddaughter, a small girl of about 6, stood beside the wagon, paralyzed with fear, her small face streaked with tears and soot. The fire was no longer on the hills. It was at the edge of town, devouring the first dry tinder buildings. A wall of heat and smoke rolled down the street. "We have to go," someone shouted. "Leave them!" But Eli was already moving. He thrust the reins into Clara's hands. "Keep going! Get to the river!" he yelled over the din. And then he was gone, a blur of motion, running not away from the danger, but directly into it. He reached the stranded family in seconds. "Get the girl!" he roared at Mr. McGregor. He drew his knife and with a few swift, expert slashes, cut the panicked horses free from their harnesses. He slapped their rumps, sending them galloping toward the river. Just as he turned back, a burning ember, carried on the superheated wind, landed on the roof of the adjacent barn. The old, dry building went up not in flames, but in a single, explosive whoosh of fire. Mr. McGregor had snatched up his granddaughter, but in the chaos, he stumbled and fell. The little girl was thrown from his arms, landing perilously close to the now collapsing barn. A heavy, burning roof beam, wreathed in flame, began to creak and give way directly above her. Clara screamed. It all happened in a horrifying instant. Eli didn't hesitate. He lunged, shoving the girl out of the way with a desperate, powerful push. She rolled clear, safe, But Eli was not fast enough to save himself. The beam came crashing down, striking him across the back and shoulders, pinning him to the ground amidst a shower of sparks and flaming debris. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of agony that was swallowed by the roar of the fire. Then he lay still. The world stopped for Clara. The fire, the smoke, the chaos, it all faded away. There was only Eli, a still, broken form amidst the flames. A sound, a raw, animalistic scream of pure anguish, was torn from her throat. Eli! She jumped from the wagon, heedless of her own safety, and ran toward him. The heat was a physical blow, searing her skin, but she didn't feel it. She reached the spot where he had fallen, but the burning wreckage was too heavy, too hot. She clawed at the smoldering wood, her hands blistering, sobbing his name over and over. And then, others were there beside her. Mr. McGregor, his face a mask of horrified gratitude, was the first. "Help her!" he bellowed, his voice raw. "That man just saved my granddaughter. Help his wife!" His wife. The word galvanized the stunned townspeople. They saw her, the quiet girl they had once scorned, fighting like a she-wolf to get to her mate. They saw her love, a thing as fierce and powerful as the fire that threatened to consume them all. And in that moment, their shame burned hotter than any flame. Sheriff Brody was there, and men from the saloon, their faces grim. They grabbed pry bars and axes, working together, with Clara directing them through her tears. They fought the flames, levering the heavy, burning beam off of Eli's body. They dragged him, unconscious and terribly burned, from the wreckage just as the rest of the barn roof collapsed in a fiery avalanche. They carried him to the riverbank, the only safe place left. The town of Dust Creek, their homes, their businesses, was being erased behind them. But on the muddy banks of the river, amidst the refugees, a new community was being forged. The town doctor, his face grim, examined Eli. "His back is badly burned," he said softly to Clara. "He took a blow to the head. There is smoke in his lungs. I've done all I can. The rest is in God's hands." They set up a makeshift camp, and for 3 days, as the fire raged and finally burned itself out, leaving behind a blackened, skeletal landscape, Clara did not leave Eli's side. The town, in its shared grief, cared for Mrs. McGregor, her face humbled and her eyes full of a debt that could never be repaid, brought her water and broth. Sarah Jenkins's mother wrapped a clean blanket around her shoulders. "You are a courageous wife, Clara Kane," the older woman said, her voice full of a newfound respect. "The most courageous I have ever known." But Clara barely heard them. Her entire world had shrunk to the space of the rough pallet where her husband lay, hovering between life and death. She bathed his face, moistened his cracked lips, and held his limp hand, willing her own strength, her own life force, into him. And she talked, in the long, silent hours, with his unconscious form as her only witness. She finally said all the things her heart had held. "You have to wake up, Eli," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "You cannot leave me. Not now. I was so afraid of you. That first night, I thought you were my jailer. I thought this place was my prison. But I was the one who was imprisoned. Wasn't I? By my mother's rules. By my own fear. You set me free." Tears streamed down her face, falling onto their joined hands. "You never tried to own me. You only ever tried to honor me. You taught me what strength is. Eli, it isn't force. It's restraint. It's gentleness. It's selling your past for the hope of a future. It's standing between a child and the fire." She leaned down, her lips close to his ear, the words a sacred confession. "I love you. I didn't know what love was until you showed me. It's this terrible, beautiful ache in my chest. So you cannot leave me, because if you do, you will not just be taking your life. You will be taking mine." For 3 days, she kept her vigil. On the morning of the 4th day, His eyelids flickered, his fingers, lying in her hand, tightened with a faint but definite pressure. Clara's heart stopped. She leaned closer, her own breath held in her chest. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, slowly opened. They were hazy with pain and confusion, but they were open. They searched, found her face, and focused. "Clara," he breathed, his voice a dry, painful rasp. A sob of pure, overwhelming joy escaped her, and she laid her head on his chest and wept. His recovery was slow and arduous, but he was alive, and he was not alone. The fire had taken their homes, but it had given them a community. The town of Dust Creek, united by the shared tragedy and by the heroism they had witnessed, was reborn from its own ashes. They started to rebuild, not as a collection of suspicious individuals, but as neighbors. The day Eli was strong enough to stand, Mr. McGregor and Sheriff Brody came to their camp. "Kane," the sheriff said, his voice full of a gruff respect. "What you did, well, this town owes you. We'd be proud if you'd help us rebuild. We want to make you our security advisor, a proper, paid position. We need a man like you to help us start over." Eli looked at the men, then at Clara, whose face was shining with pride. He nodded. "I'd be honored." The next spring, the land, too, began to heal. Out of the blackened, ash-fertilized soil, a miracle occurred. A carpet of wildflowers, more vibrant and plentiful than anyone had ever seen, burst forth, painting the scarred hills in brilliant strokes of purple, yellow, and blue. One afternoon, Eli, now strong and healed, though his back would forever carry the terrible, beautiful scars of his sacrifice, lifted Clara onto Daisy's back. He swung up behind her, his arms wrapping securely around her. She was several months pregnant now, their child a quiet, joyful promise growing within her. They rode in a comfortable silence through the impossible beauty of the reborn fields. The world was new again. Their world. He was the town's hero. She was the courageous wife. They had a future, forged in drought and fire, built on a foundation of quiet, unshakable love. Clara leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that was now as familiar and essential as her own. She looked out at the sea of wildflowers, at the new timbers of their home being raised in the distance with the help of their neighbors, and a profound, perfect peace settled over her. A memory, clear and sharp, came to her of that first terrifying night in the shack, of the confusion and fear she had felt. It seemed a lifetime ago. "He didn't touch me on our first night," she thought to herself, a gentle smile gracing her lips as she felt the arms of her husband, the father of her child, tighten around her. But that was the night my heart became his forever. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Old West. We here at the campfire love to think of you all gathered around, listening under the stars. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're in. If you enjoyed our story, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Campfire, and share your thoughts on Clara and Eli's journey. Until next time, keep your fire bright.